Well, for the first time, details of waterboarding and harsh interrogations are seeing the light of day, but the president is now catching flack from the right and the left on this. Carlos Watson has more from the politics desk. Carlos.
Thanks, Monica. Now, we're talking about 124 pages that spell out in detail controversial interrogation methods used by the CIA under former President George W. Bush. Now, President Obama is getting some praise for releasing the memos, but critics, including former Bush administration officials, say he's putting the country at risk. Now, some on the left are outraged that he's not going to prosecute interrogators. Ari Melber is a regular contributor to The Nation. Chris Wilson is a Republican strategist and pollster. Ari, let me go to you first. Do you think it stops here, or do you think that the Democratic Congress ultimately runs past President Obama and still pursues investigations?
Well, I think the Democratic Congress has to investigate this. We have really chilling, disgusting, and un-American tactics and torture that was clearly articulated in these memorandum. It is a shameful thing, obviously, for the war criminals that helped advocate these policies. It's something that our country and the world are going to have to come to grips with. And also, if you look at the public here is out in front of all the politicians in Washington. That is the case on many issues, of course. But Gallup shows that a strong majority, over 55% of the public, wants further investigations or prosecutions. We've had financial crimes, we've had war crimes, and obviously, as always, a system that operates on the rule of law has to investigate and prosecute crimes no matter who does them.
But Ari, let me push back on you, because our Joe Scarborough this morning on Morning Joe made the following argument. He said, although waterboarding is not popular, the reality is in some key cases, including, he would say, Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, that we wouldn't have captured those people or gotten critical information without the use of waterboarding, that we're not having an honest conversation about that. Do you think that's true, and do you think Democrats bear some responsibility for potentially not allowing an open conversation about what techniques work and don't work?
I don't think that claim is borne out in the memos. I mean, now we have these actual memos from within the Bush administration, and they say clearly in there that there is no clear evidence that those tactics helped prevent attacks. So we know that much. Those who argue that doing illegal things or doing war crimes help our national security are making an argument for breaking the law. And the question still remains, what do you do with people who break the law? You have to investigate and prosecute it. That is a bedrock principle in this country, and it doesn't matter whether you are in office, whether you are powerful, or whether in your own mind you are hoping to do something good. If we're not bound by the rule of law, both parties, both administrations in this case, no matter who is doing it, then we have a more fundamental problem here. And that's true regardless of whether someone else on the sidelines argues that a crime was somehow a positive thing.
All right, let me bring in Chris Wilson. Chris, you worked with former President George W. Bush back when he was governor. You worked with Karen Hughes. You worked with Karl Rove. Do you think, though, that they potentially crossed the line? And even if you don't, do you think it should be investigated?
I think what we have to understand here, Carlos, is the rules of war are different than the rule of law that's being talked about, as if this is somehow something that goes on in the streets of America. We're not talking about that. We're talking about attempts to save American lives here. And I'll tell you, one of the things that Marcus Luttrell has been in the news recently because of what happened, the tragedy with his dog being shot. And Marcus Luttrell, who wrote Lone Survivor, tells in there the story about how they had to make the decision about whether or not to act on something. And that decision was made that really cost 3 SEAL lives because of what they were afraid the media would do to them if it was found out that they made the wrong decision. And because of that, 3 SEAL lives was the worst loss of life in U.S. Navy SEAL history that day whenever they came in to try to rescue those SEALs. And I think we've got to recognize that we're really dealing with a completely different situation during times of war than we are in the United streets of the United States. And these are just different scenarios.
So
and
Chris,
to treat them the same is absurd.
Does that mean, Chris, that you support the waterboarding and the walling that's detailed in these memos? Is that what you're saying today?
My challenge here is I have not been to war. I think for anyone who has not been in that situation to sit back in a television studio and say that we understand what goes on over in Iraq and Afghanistan and the American lives that are at stake and is absurd. We haven't been in that situation.
But Chris, by that exact same logic, you're saying President Barack Obama shouldn't weigh in. By that exact same logic, you're saying that Dick Cheney, who never served, shouldn't weigh in.
No, I'm not saying that they shouldn't weigh in. That's entirely different. What I'm saying is that we cannot stand back and try and govern the actions of our military during times of war by writing laws down on a piece of paper when we haven't been there ourselves.
It is our duty to govern the actions of our military, and we have civilian control of the military because citizens and civilian commanders ultimately oversee what our military does. Our military serves bravely, no one is attacking them, and you are trying to distract from the issue,
how many military men and women have to die because we stand back and write laws about this whenever we don't understand
Ari
it.
and Chris, I hate to do this, but we've got to leave that there. But you guys make sure you come back and join us again. We want to follow up on that conversation next week.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you both. In other news coming up, the movement.